They were born into privilege, but destined to remain unseen, standing just beyond the glow of the throne. Their lives were shaped by duty, their choices bound by politics, and their dreams sacrificed for dynastic survival. Behind every celebrated monarch was a brother or sister whose story ended in quiet tragedy. They carried the same royal blood, yet their names slipped through the cracks of history. Welcome to my channel, Words of Time, and in this video, we will explore the forgotten royal siblings whose untold stories reveal the true cost of power and the shadows behind the crown. Imagine a life born into unimaginable privilege, surrounded by luxury, ceremony, and reverence, yet shadowed by a destiny that denies true freedom. History remembers the crowned heads, the rulers who shaped nations and carried the weight of power. But for every monarch whose name endures, there were siblings who shared their blood and birthright, yet were left to fade into quiet tragedy. Think of Prince John of Gaunt, Prince Arthur Tudor, or Princess Alice of Hesse. Each born into royalty, each destined to watch as their fortunes turned from light to shadow. Their stories remind us that the glitter of a crown often conceals the sorrow of those standing just outside its reach. In the vast theater of monarchy, the role of a ruler is clearly defined, but the parts assigned to their brothers and sisters are often uncertain and fraught with danger. These lesser-known royals, often called spare heirs, were born into a peculiar paradox. Their existence was both vital and perilous. They stood close enough to the throne to be important, but not close enough to wield power without suspicion. From the moment of their birth, their lives were marked by an invisible burden, useful when the dynasty needed stability, expendable when it needed unity. The phrase heir and spare was not merely a label but a fate. The heir carried the crown, the spare carried the uncertainty of what that meant for their own survival. Throughout history, the position of the spare heir has been a dangerous one. In some cases, it was a life of constant vigilance, waiting for the chance to serve or perhaps inherit through tragedy. In others, it was a slow decline into insignificance, trapped by royal protocols and stripped of purpose. Monarchies depend on clear succession, yet the presence of additional heirs often sowed tension within the court. Jealousy, rivalry, and political manipulation turned families into battlegrounds. Behind the portraits and palaces were human stories marked by isolation, fear, and longing for identity beyond birthright. The fragile balance between loyalty and ambition defined the lives of these forgotten figures. Some were loyal to their reigning siblings, dedicating themselves to service and stability. Others, out of frustration or external influence, became instruments of conspiracy. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control: marriage alliances, political intrigue, and the unpredictable nature of royal favor. Theirs was not a story of rebellion or villainy, but of quiet suffering under expectations they could never fulfill. Consider the young Prince Arthur Tudor, born as the great hope of the Tudor dynasty. He was the first legitimate son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, destined to secure the fragile peace after years of civil war. Yet his life was cut short before he could inherit, and his death changed the course of English history. His younger brother Henry, originally the spare, became king instead. That shift in destiny altered not only their personal fates, but also the fate of an entire nation. Henry, the second son who was never meant to rule, grew into a monarch both formidable and destructive. The loss of Arthur revealed how fragile dynastic planning could be, and how the death of one prince could ignite a legacy of ambition and cruelty in another. The story of Princess Alice of Hesse offers a different kind of sorrow. Born into the British royal family, she lived a life of duty and compassion, yet her path was shadowed by personal loss and tragedy. As the daughter of Queen Victoria, she was raised under the weight of expectation, but was often overshadowed by her siblings and by her mother's imposing presence. Her marriage to Louis of Hesse placed her far from home, and though she embraced her new role with grace, her life became marked by grief. Epidemics, family illness, and the relentless demands of royalty tested her endurance. She devoted herself to nursing and social reform, but her efforts were often overlooked in the grandeur of empire. Her death at a young age mirrored the decline of the world she was born to serve, as the European royal houses began to fracture under modern pressures. Prince John of Gaunt's life reveals another layer of this enduring theme. As the son of Edward III of England, John was powerful, wealthy, and influential, yet his position was constantly defined by proximity to the crown rather than possession of it. He became a central figure in English politics, supporting the monarchy while also shaping it from the shadows. Despite his power, John's ambitions were restrained by his duty to his nephew, Richard II. His descendants would one day claim the throne through the Lancastrian line, but during his lifetime he existed in the uncertain space between service and suspicion. His story shows how even the most privileged spares could become both the guardians and the threats to royal stability. The role of these figures extended beyond personal tragedy. They embodied the political logic of dynasties that relied on human lives to secure continuity. In kingdoms where lineage meant survival, every royal child was a piece on a board governed by bloodlines and treaties. To be the spare was to live at the mercy of shifting alliances. A marriage could make one a king. A rumor could turn one into a prisoner. Many such lives ended in quiet exile or public downfall. History remembers their names only when they shaped the fate of others, yet their stories reveal how power and powerlessness coexisted within the same family. The danger for spare heirs was not limited to their own ambition. They were also targets for manipulation by those seeking influence. Foreign powers often saw in them a chance to claim control through marriage or rebellion. Courtiers whispered in their ears, promising glory if they challenged the throne or sowed dissent. Some resisted and lived in relative peace, but many fell victim to intrigue. Their choices were few: obedience, rebellion, or retreat. Each path carried its own peril. The emotional toll of this existence cannot be understated. These princes and princesses grew up in courts where affection was often conditional and loyalty was tested daily. Their worth was measured by their potential to serve the dynasty, not by personal merit. The heir received the devotion of the court, the spare received its suspicion. In such an environment, relationships were fragile. Sibling bonds could be genuine, but were often overshadowed by political necessity. Even in private, the sense of being watched and weighed never left them. The isolation of the royal spare was intensified by the contradictions of their lives. They were public figures with no true authority, symbols of stability who often felt displaced. Their titles provided privilege, but also confinement. Many longed for ordinary lives, but were denied the chance. When they married, their unions were seldom for love. When they sought independence, they were reminded of their duty. This internal conflict defined generations of royal siblings, from the medieval courts of Europe to the modern age. As monarchies evolved, so too did the fate of those outside the immediate line of succession. Some were allowed to pursue military careers or charitable work, carving a sense of purpose beyond politics. Yet even in modern times, the tension between duty and individuality persisted. The struggle of the spare heir is not confined to one era. It reflects a universal truth about families built around power. Every royal household needed an heir to ensure continuity, but it was the spare who often revealed the human cost of monarchy. The first case we will explore reflects the cruel irony of being born both central and invisible, vital yet vulnerable. It is the story of a royal sibling whose life was a political tool from the moment of birth. This figure's existence was a bargaining chip in courtly games of alliance and betrayal, a life defined by the power they could never fully claim. Their fate was sealed not by personal failure, but by the system that needed them without truly valuing them. Through this lens, the theme of Echoes from the Cradle, the unseen shadows, begins to take form. It is a meditation on those who lived under the same roof as greatness, but were destined to remain in its shade. The heir was celebrated, the ruler remembered, but the spare often carried the emotional weight of the dynasty. These forgotten siblings were witnesses to history's grandest moments, their own stories muted by the noise of power. The contrast between privilege and helplessness is what makes their tales so compelling. They were born to riches most could not imagine, yet they were denied the freedom that ordinary people took for granted. Every decision they made was scrutinized, every affection was politicized. Their joys were rarely their own, their sorrows often hidden. To understand their lives is to understand the silent cost of monarchy, the toll it exacted not only on rulers, but also on those born to stand beside them, unseen but indispensable. The idea of the spare heir continues to echo through modern discussions of royalty. It remains a reminder that hierarchy within families, when bound to power, distorts love and loyalty. These historical figures remind us that even within gilded walls, human hearts suffer the same struggles of longing, loss, and identity. Their stories, though largely forgotten, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to greater reigns, but as lives that reveal the full spectrum of what it meant to be royal. The first of these forgotten lives captures all the contradictions of this existence. A child of privilege, raised in splendor, shaped by duty and undone by politics. A life defined by service to a throne they would never occupy, and by loyalty that could never guarantee safety. Theirs is not merely a tale of personal misfortune, but a reflection of an ancient truth, that proximity to power does not bring peace. It brings only the echo of the crown, a sound that promises greatness, yet delivers only shadow. And it is into this first shadowed life that we now turn, to trace the contours of a destiny written not by choice but by birth. The story now moves from the shadows of potential to the painful clarity of loss. The first figure in this long chain of forgotten or overshadowed royals is Prince Arthur Tudor, whose short life and premature death reshaped the destiny of England in ways he could never have imagined. Born into a family still haunted by war, Arthur was meant to be the answer to decades of instability. He was the firstborn son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, a child whose existence symbolized the end of the Wars of the Roses and the merging of two rival houses. His very birth was celebrated as divine assurance that peace had returned to England. Yet behind the ceremonies and triumphs, the young prince's life was marked by fragility, pressure, and the heavy hand of political expectation. Arthur was born in Winchester, the legendary seat of King Arthur of old, deliberately chosen by his father to connect his new dynasty with the mythical past of Britain. Even his name was political, meant to evoke the grandeur of a hero king and establish the Tudors as rightful rulers. From infancy, his life was mapped out with precision. His education was rigorous, guided by some of the finest scholars of his time, for he was being shaped to rule a realm that still doubted its own unity. The court lavished attention on him, but his body was never as strong as his destiny demanded. Accounts describe him as intelligent, graceful, and earnest, yet often sickly, burdened with ailments that kept him from fully embodying the robust image of a future monarch. From childhood, Arthur was a pawn in a complex network of European politics. His father, a cautious and pragmatic ruler, sought to secure alliances that would protect his fragile throne. Marriage was the key tool of diplomacy, and Arthur's hand was promised early to Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This alliance was meant to unite two powerful realms and deter any future rebellion against the Tudor line. For England, the match promised legitimacy and strength. For Spain, it offered influence and partnership. Yet for the young prince, it meant a life predetermined by the ambitions of others. Arthur and Catherine's union was arranged when they were still children, a reminder of how little autonomy royal offspring possessed. The correspondence between their courts reveals the intensity of the negotiations, every clause weighed to ensure political advantage. The children themselves had no say, though their futures were sealed long before they met. In the royal courts of Europe, such arrangements were common, but for Arthur, whose health was fragile, the pressure was especially cruel. He was trained for kingship, surrounded by ceremony, yet deprived of the simplicity of youth. Every move was observed, every weakness noted. When Catherine arrived in England, the union was celebrated as the dawn of a new era. Their wedding in St. Paul's Cathedral was one of the most magnificent ceremonies of its time, filled with music, pageantry, and the hope of continuity. The young couple was sent to Ludlow Castle, the traditional seat of the Prince of Wales, where Arthur was expected to begin governing in preparation for his future rule. Yet the triumph of his marriage quickly turned to tragedy. Within months, both Arthur and Catherine fell ill, possibly from the sweating sickness that swept through the region. Catherine recovered, but Arthur did not. His death at only 15 years old marked a turning point not only for his family, but for the entire kingdom. Arthur's passing left his parents devastated and England unsettled once again. The long-awaited heir was gone, and the future rested in the hands of his younger brother, Henry. The boy who had been raised in the shadow of his elder sibling suddenly found himself the center of a dynasty's hopes. For the young Henry, this transition was both a blessing and a burden. He had not been prepared for the throne in the same way Arthur had been, and his reign would reflect the insecurities and ambitions born from that abrupt shift in destiny. Arthur's death did more than alter the line of succession. It changed the very course of English history. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was both a political necessity and a theological dilemma. The union required special permission from the Pope, granted under the claim that Catherine and Arthur's marriage had not been consummated. That dispensation, and the question of its validity, would later become the spark that ignited the English Reformation. When Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine years later, citing the belief that their union was cursed due to her prior marriage to his brother. He set in motion the break with Rome that forever changed England's religious and political landscape. Thus, the life and death of Prince Arthur had consequences that reached far beyond his own brief existence. His story is a reminder that even in death, a royal child could shape the fate of nations. He was the prince who was never king, yet his absence created a vacuum that his brother filled with unprecedented ambition. The Reformation, the dissolution of monasteries, and the birth of the Church of England all trace their roots back to the tomb of a frail boy in Worcester Cathedral. In the broader context of monarchy, Arthur's fate illustrates the peril of being born into a system that valued succession above all else. He was cherished not for who he was, but for what he represented, the survival of a dynasty. His health was fragile, but the expectations placed upon him were unyielding. Even in his final days, there was no escape from the weight of duty. The sorrow that followed his death was not simply a family's grief. It was the mourning of a nation forced once again to confront its uncertainty. The political consequences of his death rippled through Europe. The alliance with Spain, once secure, became precarious. Ferdinand and Isabella hesitated to renew their commitment to England, uncertain whether the new heir would continue the match. The betrothal between Catherine and the young Henry became a matter of strategic negotiation, its outcome dictated by shifting tides of diplomacy rather than affection. For years, Catherine's position remained uncertain, her fate suspended by the ambitions of kings and counselors. Behind these political maneuvers were human lives trapped in a web of expectation. Catherine, widowed almost before her marriage had begun, was left in a foreign court with little protection. Her own letters reveal the anxiety and isolation she felt during those years. For Henry, growing up in the shadow of a dead brother, the pressure to fulfill both his own destiny and Arthur's legacy shaped his character in ways that would later define his rule. His obsession with producing an heir, his defiance of religious authority, and his volatile relationships all bear the imprint of a man haunted by the fragility of succession. Arthur's life also offers a lens into the fragile nature of monarchy itself. For all its grandeur, a dynasty could hinge on the health of a single child. The Tudors, like many royal houses, built their security on bodies that were often weak, unprepared, or overburdened. In Arthur's case, the machinery of monarchy moved faster than the human heart could bear. He was married, crowned as Prince of Wales, and thrust into governance before his body had the strength to endure it. The rush to secure the dynasty came at the cost of the young prince's well-being. His story also reflects the way royal families were entangled in the ruthless politics of their time. Monarchs were not immune to the same forces that shaped the fates of ordinary people: disease, uncertainty, and loss. Yet their suffering was amplified by the weight of expectation. The death of a royal child could unravel alliances, invite war, or shift the balance of power across continents. Every decision regarding their lives carried consequences beyond personal grief. Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was meant to unite two kingdoms. His death instead exposed the fragility of those very plans. In the aftermath, Henry VII retreated into private sorrow, his ambitions dimmed by loss. Queen Elizabeth of York, already weakened by childbirth and mourning, died not long after, plunging the king into deeper despair. The Tudor court, once filled with optimism, became a place of mourning and tension. The surviving children, including young Henry, grew up in an atmosphere shaped by grief and caution. The memory of Arthur lingered like a ghost, a reminder of both hope and failure. Arthur's death also marked a subtle transformation in the nature of kingship itself. Henry VIII's reign, shaped by this early tragedy, became one of centralization and control. Determined never to let the dynasty falter again, he redefined the relationship between crown and country. The fear of instability that had haunted his father turned into a drive for absolute authority in the son. The personal loss of one brother became the political foundation of another's rule. This transformation was not unique to the Tudors. Across Europe, the fragility of royal bloodlines created similar tensions. Monarchs sought security through marriage, alliances, and heirs, yet each generation faced the same uncertainty. The role of siblings in these families was often defined by their usefulness in securing treaties or providing alternatives should tragedy strike. For many, this meant lives spent in waiting for inheritance, for marriage, or for purpose. For some, it meant early death. Prince Arthur's story reveals that even in its earliest days, the Tudor dynasty was built on sacrifice. His life, brief as it was, became the cornerstone upon which his brother's reign was constructed. The Reformation, the emergence of England as a sovereign power distinct from papal influence, and the later rise of Elizabeth I all trace their lineage back to that single, silent loss in Ludlow. The course of nations often turns on moments of private grief, and Arthur's death was one such moment. In examining his short existence, one can also see the broader truth of monarchy's human cost. Behind the triumphs of kings and queens were children raised in gilded cages, shaped by forces beyond their control. Theirs was not a life of choice but of design, each step dictated by politics. Arthur's death reminds us that even those born to rule could be rendered powerless by the simplest of human vulnerabilities. The alliance with Spain, meant to secure England's future, became instead the seed of conflict that would later divide Europe. The marriage that began in promise ended in schism. When Henry VIII later broke with Rome to annul his union with Catherine, he invoked divine judgment, claiming their marriage was cursed because it defied the natural order. That claim rested on the memory of Arthur, the brother who had been both the key to alliance and the symbol of its failure. Arthur's story does not end with his burial. It lingers in the architecture of power that followed. Every decision Henry made regarding succession, marriage, and faith carried the echo of that early death. The fear of dying without a male heir, the desperate pursuit of legitimacy, and the creation of new religious structures all stemmed from that single disruption in the Tudor line. Arthur's life was short, but his influence endured for generations. His quiet tragedy also set the pattern for other royal siblings who followed in later centuries. They too would live under the shadow of destiny, their lives shaped by the needs of their families rather than their own desires. Some, like Arthur, would die young. Others would survive to see how easily favor turned to exile. Each, in their own way, would embody the tension between power and vulnerability that defined royal existence. Arthur Tudor stands as the first in a long sequence of royal figures whose fates were determined by forces larger than themselves. His story connects directly to those who came after, the princes and princesses born into privilege yet bound by duty, each serving as a living reminder of how precarious the promise of monarchy truly was. From his death sprang the rise of one of England's most transformative rulers, yet the cost of that transformation was measured in human sorrow. The tale of Prince Arthur is not merely a footnote in the history of kings. It is the foundation of an empire's evolution and a testament to the quiet sacrifices that lie beneath grand narratives. His life represents the fragility of power, the pain of expectation, and the enduring truth that greatness often grows from loss. As we look to the next of these royal figures, those who reached adulthood only to find their own paths constrained by politics and perception, Arthur's story remains a haunting reminder that every crown rests upon the invisible weight of those who never wore it. The story of royal siblings now moves from the silent loss of youth to the lingering sorrows of adulthood, from the brief life of Prince Arthur Tudor to those who lived long enough to endure the consequences of royal duty. If Arthur's death revealed the fragile machinery of monarchy, then Princess Alice, Grand Duchess of Hesse and by Rhine, embodied the emotional weight of what it meant to survive within it. Her story is not one of political rebellion or public scandal, but of quiet endurance and deep personal pain. She was born into the height of royal grandeur, yet her life became a meditation on the limits of privilege and the inescapable reach of fate. Princess Alice was the third child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, a daughter born into a family that seemed to rule not only an empire, but the very spirit of the 19th century. Her parents were the moral and domestic ideal of their time, admired across Europe for their devotion to duty and family. Yet, within that celebrated household, the royal children lived under a system of discipline and control that left little room for individuality. Alice, though intelligent and empathetic, learned early that affection was conditional and independence discouraged. Queen Victoria, devoted to principle and reputation, expected obedience above all else. In that environment, Alice's gentleness and emotional insight often went unnoticed, buried beneath the demands of royal expectation. From an early age, Alice was prepared for the responsibilities of her position, not as a future monarch, but as a daughter whose marriage would strengthen alliances abroad. Unlike her brothers, who were educated for leadership, her lessons were aimed at refinement and readiness to serve as a consort. The future of such royal daughters was not their own to decide. Each was a piece in the grand puzzle of European politics, destined to reinforce the bonds between royal houses through carefully arranged marriages. For Alice, The match came with Louis, the heir to the Grand Duchy of Hesse, a small but respected German state. Their engagement was arranged shortly before the death of her father, Prince Albert, an event that left an indelible mark on her life. Alice had been among the most devoted of his children, and his death cast her into deep sorrow. In her letters, she revealed a tenderness and spiritual longing that separated her from the emotional restraint of her mother. Where Queen Victoria's grief hardened into isolation, Alice's transformed into compassion. She became a caregiver to the grieving queen, often at the cost of her own well-being. Her marriage to Louis followed soon after, shadowed by mourning. Even on her wedding day, the atmosphere was somber, the royal family wore black, and the celebrations were subdued. It was a union born under the weight of loss, and that tone would define much of her married life. Life in Hesse was a stark contrast to the splendor of Windsor and Buckingham Palace. The court was smaller, the politics more provincial, and the resources limited. For Alice, who had been raised amidst the grandeur of the British Empire, the adjustment was difficult. Yet she approached her new role with sincerity and diligence. She and Louis shared affection and respect, though their temperaments differed. He was amiable but reserved, more comfortable with routine than with the depth of emotion that defined Alice's nature. She sought purpose beyond the ceremonial expectations of her station, devoting herself to charitable work, nursing, and the improvement of public health. Her empathy for the suffering of others found its most powerful expression during the wars that swept through Germany in the later decades of the century. While other royal women confined themselves to symbolic gestures, Alice took direct action. She visited hospitals, tended to the wounded, and organized nursing efforts inspired by the work of Florence Nightingale. Her compassion was genuine, but it often placed her at odds with court conventions. Many among the nobility disapproved of her hands-on approach, viewing it as undignified for a woman of her rank. Yet Alice persisted, guided by a conviction that service was the truest expression of her faith and duty. Despite her public role, her private life was filled with sorrow. She bore several children, and motherhood became both her joy and her greatest source of pain. The demands of royal duty often kept her apart from them, as travel, representation, and protocol required constant attention. Still, she tried to create a home marked by affection rather than formality, perhaps as a quiet rejection of the cold emotional atmosphere of her childhood. Her letters to her children reveal a woman of deep feeling, attentive and gentle, striving to raise them with warmth that she herself had often been denied. Tragedy, however, seemed to follow her. One of her sons, Fritti, was born with hemophilia, a genetic disorder that would haunt many descendants of Queen Victoria. His condition meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Alice's fear for him was constant, and her worst nightmares came true when, at the age of 3, he suffered a fatal fall. The loss devastated her. Her letters from that period show a grief that was raw and consuming. She questioned her faith, her purpose, and even her strength to continue her duties. Yet, as always, she carried on, masking her pain behind a sense of responsibility that the world expected from a princess. The death of her child marked the beginning of a long decline, not only in her personal life, but also in the fortunes of her family and the European monarchies they represented. The later decades of the 19th century saw growing unrest, the spread of republican ideas, and a waning belief in the divine right of kings. The great dynasties of Europe, once secure in their power, began to feel the tremors of change. Alice's family in Hesse, like many others, faced financial and political strain. The pomp of royal life no longer inspired devotion among the people as it once had. In many ways, her struggles mirrored the uncertainty of the age itself. Amidst these shifts, Alice's role as a royal woman remained tightly constrained. Her marriage, like those of many of her sisters, was designed to strengthen dynastic ties, not to fulfill personal desires. Her position demanded constant diplomacy, balancing the expectations of the British crown with the traditions of her adopted homeland. She wrote often to her mother, who continued to exert influence even across distance. Their correspondence, though affectionate, was marked by tension. Queen Victoria viewed her daughter's independence with disapproval, often criticizing her choices and dismissing her emotional openness as weakness. For Alice, such disapproval was a recurring wound, a reminder that even as a wife and mother, she remained under the shadow of parental authority. The psychological toll of such a life was immense. Alice was caught between two worlds, her duty to her birth family and her loyalty to her new home, her public role as a Grand Duchess and her private longing for peace. The structure of royal life allowed little space for introspection or rest. Every act, every letter, every appearance carried political significance. The constant vigilance required to maintain dignity and favor left little room for vulnerability. Yet Alice's humanity refused to be silenced. She continued to express her compassion through her actions, even when they drew criticism. Her devotion to her family and to the ideals of service ultimately cost her her life. In the winter of 1878, a diphtheria epidemic struck her household. Several of her children fell ill, and Alice, as she had done throughout her life, tended to them herself. Despite the danger, she refused to leave their side. Her dedication was both an act of love and a reflection of her deep sense of duty. One of her daughters, May, succumbed to the disease, and Alice's grief was overwhelming. Soon after, she too contracted the infection. Her final days were marked by weakness and quiet resignation. She died at the age of 35, on the anniversary of her father's death, as if her life had come full circle. Her death shocked Europe, though perhaps it did not surprise those who knew her heart. She had always given too much of herself to others. Her passing was mourned deeply by her family, but it also served as a symbolic moment in a changing era. The image of a princess who died in service to her family rather than in the splendor of courtly life captured the shifting sentiment of the times. The grandeur of monarchy was beginning to seem less noble and more tragic. The very qualities that had once inspired awe, duty, sacrifice, and divine destiny, now appeared to demand too great a cost. The personal tragedies that defined Alice's life were mirrored by the gradual decline of the European monarchies she represented. The world was moving toward new ideas of governance, equality, and national identity. The bonds between royal families, once the foundation of political order, began to weaken. The alliances that had been built through marriages like Alice's could no longer sustain the growing tensions of modernity. Within a few decades, wars and revolutions would sweep away much of the old order, leaving only echoes of the once mighty dynasties that had ruled the continent. Alice's legacy extended far beyond her own lifetime. Her children and grandchildren would carry her blood into the turbulent years of the 20th century. Her daughter Alix would become Empress Alexandra of Russia, wife of Nicholas II, and her life would end in the violence of revolution. The same genetic disorder that had taken Alice's son would reappear in her Russian descendants, symbolizing how the personal and political were forever intertwined in royal history. The compassion that had defined Alice's life would find tragic expression in the isolation and downfall of her daughter. The cycle of duty, sacrifice, and sorrow continued, even as the world around them changed beyond recognition. Through Princess Alice's story, we see the cost of adulthood in the royal world. Survival beyond childhood was not liberation, but a continuation of captivity. The cage that held her was not built of stone or iron, but of expectations, tradition, and the relentless gaze of history. Her intelligence, compassion, and humanity made her admirable, but they also made her vulnerable in a system that valued image over emotion. The iron grip of adulthood in royal life lay in its demand for constant performance. Every gesture was a statement, every silence a risk. For women like Alice, there was no true freedom, only the illusion of choice within the boundaries of duty. Her life also reflects a broader truth about the decline of dynastic Europe. The 19th century was a time of transition, when the divine right of kings gave way to the idea of national sovereignty, when the bonds of blood could no longer guarantee peace. Royal families clung to old forms of power, even as the world moved beyond them. In that struggle between past and future, individuals like Alice became casualties. Their personal suffering echoed the larger disintegration of the world they represented. Princess Alice's story is not one of rebellion but of endurance, a quiet defiance expressed through compassion rather than conflict. Her life demonstrates how the burdens of rank could inspire both greatness and despair. In her care for the sick, her devotion to her children, and her willingness to sacrifice herself, she embodied the noblest ideals of service. Yet the very system that celebrated those virtues offered her no protection from the pain they caused. She was both a product of her time and a victim of its contradictions. The connection between her personal tragedies and the decline of her dynasty is more than symbolic. It reveals the deep fragility of systems built on hierarchy and inheritance. As Europe moved toward modernity, the old structures could no longer contain the human cost of their own preservation. The suffering of individuals like Alice showed that the foundation of royal power was not divine, but deeply human, and therefore vulnerable. Her death closed one chapter of the 19th century but opened another, one that would see her descendants and their contemporaries face the full collapse of the old order. The same forces that had defined her life, duty, lineage, and alliance would soon lead to the catastrophic wars that tore Europe apart. The monarchy that had once seemed eternal would prove mortal after all, undone not by rebellion from below, but by the weight of its own contradictions. Princess Alice's life, in all its sorrow and grace, stands as a testament to the unseen burdens of privilege. She lived not for glory but for compassion, and in doing so revealed the quiet heroism of endurance. Her story follows naturally from the silence left by Prince Arthur Tudor, a continuation of the theme that those born near power often pay the highest price for it. His death reshaped history. Her life reflected the cost of that history upon the human soul. Together, they remind us that the crown's brilliance has always depended upon the sacrifices of those who stood just outside its light. History is shaped as much by the lives that ended too soon as by those that endured. In the quiet space between what was and what might have been lies an entire world of lost possibilities. From the silenced promise of Prince Arthur Tudor to the quiet suffering of Princess Alice, the pattern has been one of absence shaping destiny. Each departure altered the course of monarchies, leaving behind questions that can never be answered but are impossible to ignore. It is within this realm of speculation, grounded in history but animated by imagination, that the whispers of what if begin to speak. Among the 20th century's royal figures, few embody this tension between reality and potential more poignantly than Prince George, Duke of Kent. The younger brother of King George VI and uncle to the present British monarch, he lived in an age when monarchy itself was being forced to adapt or risk irrelevance. He represented a bridge between tradition and modernity, a man who combined aristocratic charm with a restless, forward-looking mind. His life was one of glamour, controversy, and quiet reform. Yet his death, in a mysterious plane crash during the Second World War, cut short a career that might have transformed the monarchy's role in post-war Britain. Prince George was born into a world still basking in the grandeur of empire. The early 20th century seemed to promise stability, but beneath the surface, old certainties were collapsing. Monarchies across Europe had already fallen to revolution and war, and Britain's royal family had only narrowly preserved its position by adapting its identity, even changing its name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor to distance itself from German connections. In that shifting landscape, Prince George came of age as part of a generation forced to reconcile inherited privilege with the demands of a rapidly changing society. Unlike some of his predecessors, George possessed a natural understanding of the importance of public perception. He recognized that the survival of the monarchy in the modern age depended on its ability to connect with ordinary people. He was well-educated, fluent in several languages, and deeply interested in the arts, architecture, and social welfare. He served in both the Royal Navy and the Foreign Office, experiences that gave him insight into the machinery of state and the realities of global politics. He was not content to remain a ceremonial figure. He sought relevance through engagement, often visiting industrial sites and meeting workers, presenting an image of royalty that was less distant and more human. Yet his life was not without turbulence. The Duke of Kent was known for his elegance and charm, but also for a personal restlessness that sometimes led him into scandal. He was associated with artistic and bohemian circles, socialized with figures who lived far outside the constraints of royal convention, and was rumored to have been involved in affairs that embarrassed the palace. These complexities made him both fascinating and problematic, but they also humanized him in ways that traditional royalty rarely managed. He seemed to grasp instinctively that the monarchy's future lay in embracing transparency and modernity, rather than clinging to the rigid hierarchies of the past. When the Second World War erupted, George returned to military service, joining the Royal Air Force despite his rank and privilege. It was an act that reflected both duty and defiance, duty to his country and defiance of expectation. His willingness to serve in a dangerous role rather than a purely symbolic one set him apart from many of his peers. In 1942, he boarded a plane bound for Iceland on a mission that remains shrouded in uncertainty. The aircraft crashed in Scotland, killing all but one aboard. The official explanation cited poor weather and navigational error, but the details were never fully clarified, and speculation about the true purpose of the flight has persisted ever since. His death at 40 years old left a silence in the royal family that echoed through subsequent decades. In losing him, Britain lost not just a prince, but a possible architect of change. His elder brother, King George VI, carried the burden of kingship through war and illness, projecting stability and duty, but often at great personal cost. Prince George might have provided a counterbalance, a figure capable of engaging with the new social realities emerging from the conflict. His understanding of culture, his international outlook, and his instinct for modernization could have helped guide the monarchy through the challenges of a world that was moving rapidly away from empire and deference. It is worth asking what might have unfolded had the Duke of Kent lived beyond that fateful flight. His survival could have reshaped not only the royal family, but the public's perception of it. The post-war years were a time of profound change. Britain was rebuilding its cities, redefining its place in the world, and watching the slow disintegration of its colonial empire. A younger royal voice, one fluent in modern ideas and comfortable with the realities of social reform, could have provided the monarchy with a moral and cultural compass. George's charisma and intellect might have bridged the growing gap between royalty and the public, ensuring that the institution remained relevant to an age increasingly defined by merit rather than inheritance. His close ties to European royalty, along with his diplomatic background, might have also influenced Britain's approach to international relations. Fluent in French and German, he was well-positioned to serve as an informal envoy, helping to rebuild relationships across a war-torn continent. His understanding of European culture and his personal charm could have strengthened post-war cooperation long before formal alliances took shape. One can imagine him advocating for unity and mutual understanding in a continent still scarred by division, perhaps even laying early groundwork for the partnerships that would later define Europe's recovery. Domestically, his influence might have softened the image of the monarchy during the difficult years of austerity that followed the war. The royal family, though admired for its wartime sacrifices, faced growing scrutiny as Britain shifted toward a more egalitarian society. George's progressive instincts and empathy for ordinary citizens could have made him a natural figurehead for modernization. He might have supported social initiatives, championed the arts, or even encouraged the royal household to engage more directly with public life. His interest in architecture and design might have led him to play a role in post-war reconstruction, promoting new housing and urban planning projects that reflected the democratic spirit of the time. The psychological effect of his continued presence on his family would also have been significant. King George VI was a reluctant monarch, plagued by anxiety and ill health. The weight of wartime leadership left him exhausted, and he leaned heavily on his wife and advisors for support. A surviving younger brother, active and capable, might have eased that burden, offering counsel and companionship. The king's early death, which brought his daughter Elizabeth to the throne at a young age, might even have been delayed if he had shared more of his responsibilities with a trusted sibling. For Queen Elizabeth II, growing up with an uncle like George could have provided a model of modernity at a crucial moment. His worldly perspective and informal charm might have influenced her approach to leadership, perhaps making her reign more open to adaptation in its early years. His experience abroad and his appreciation for cultural diversity could have shaped how the royal family engaged with the Commonwealth, encouraging a more personal and flexible approach to diplomacy. The absence of Prince George also left a void in the image of the royal family itself. His combination of intellect, style, and emotional accessibility was rare within the rigid structures of monarchy. In a world increasingly shaped by media, he might have redefined the royal relationship with the press and the public. Instead of the cautious distance that later characterized much of the monarchy's interaction with journalists, George's openness and flair might have created a culture of engagement and authenticity. The royal family's later struggles with public image, most notably in the late 20th century, might have unfolded differently had he lived to establish a precedent for modern communication. The loss of Prince George also symbolizes a recurring pattern within royal history, the disappearance of those who might have brought renewal. Just as Prince Arthur Tudor's early death altered the course of religion and governance in England, and Princess Alice's passing marked the decline of an old European order, George's death removed a potential reformer at a moment of critical transformation. In each case, history seems to have chosen continuity over change, leaving behind a sense of unfinished evolution. It is easy to imagine the Duke of Kent emerging as a leading figure in post-war cultural life, bridging the divide between the monarchy and the creative world. His friendships with artists, writers, and musicians had already begun to erode the boundaries of royal convention. In a different timeline, he might have become a patron of modern art or social welfare, positioning the monarchy not as a relic of empire, but as a living institution connected to the changing pulse of society. His influence could have encouraged a more inclusive image of royalty, one aligned with the values of a democratic age rather than the nostalgia of an imperial past. If he had lived, he might have also played a vital role in guiding the next generation of royals. His understanding of both privilege and responsibility could have offered a template for public service that balanced duty with humanity. He might have become a mentor to younger family members, emphasizing empathy and engagement over protocol. The image of royalty as compassionate and accessible, something that later generations worked hard to cultivate, might have found its first real expression through him. The ripple effects of his survival extend even further. The monarchy's place within Britain's constitutional framework might have evolved differently under his influence. His modern outlook could have supported gradual reforms in transparency and communication between the royal household and the government, helping to prevent some of the crises that later threatened the institution's credibility. By acting as a bridge between tradition and progress, he might have helped preserve not only the monarchy's relevance, but its moral authority. His untimely death, by contrast, reinforced the monarchy's instinct toward caution. The loss of a charismatic and unconventional figure left the institution more reliant on formality and restraint, qualities that served it well during times of crisis, but often left it struggling to connect emotionally with the public. The decades that followed saw a royal family respected for its dignity, but frequently criticized for its distance. The absence of figures like George, the imaginative, flawed, human faces of royalty, meant that the institution survived but did not evolve as swiftly as it might have. The mystery surrounding his final flight only deepened the sense of what was lost. Rumors of secret missions, diplomatic errands, or intelligence work added an air of intrigue that has never fully dissipated. Whether or not these stories hold truth, they underscore how closely his life was tied to the hidden workings of history. A prince who might have become a symbol of transparency instead became an enigma, his legacy confined to speculation. In that sense, his story mirrors those of Arthur Tudor and Princess Alice. Lives that ended at the threshold of change, leaving others to bear the consequences of their absence. Had Prince George lived, he might have helped guide Britain through the difficult process of shedding its empire while preserving its sense of identity. His fluency in languages, his cosmopolitan outlook, and his deep understanding of European politics could have made him a key figure in shaping post-imperial diplomacy. Perhaps his presence would have encouraged earlier and more harmonious engagement with continental partners, potentially easing the tensions that would later define Britain's relationship with Europe. His continued influence might also have altered the monarchy's cultural image. Instead of being seen as an institution slow to adapt, it might have been viewed as progressive, worldly, and responsive. The connection between royalty and the public could have been less about ceremony and more about shared experience. The royal family might have emerged from the 20th century not merely as a symbol of continuity, but as a genuine participant in the social transformation of the age. Yet history is not built on what might have been. The Duke of Kent's death, like those of Arthur Tudor and Princess Alice, reminds us that history's course is shaped as much by absence as by action. His loss left a gap that no one filled, a void that changed the emotional and political balance of the royal family. The monarchy that survived into the modern era did so not through transformation, but through endurance. The figures who might have carried it into a new age were gone, leaving their heirs to navigate change with fewer guides and greater caution. In reflecting on these unseen lives, one realizes how fragile the threads of history truly are. The death of a prince or princess does not merely close a chapter, it alters the narrative that follows. The reforms not pursued, the alliances not forged, the compassion not expressed, all become silent forces shaping what remains. The lives of Arthur Tudor, Princess Alice, and Prince George form a hidden lineage within royal history, a series of echoes that remind us that destiny is never fixed. Their stories, taken together, reveal that monarchy's greatest transformations often arise from its deepest losses. The crown endures not because it is perfect, but because it is haunted by the memory of what might have been. Prince George's absence, like Arthur's and Alice's before him, is a reminder that history is not only written by those who reign, but also by those who almost did. The voids they left became the spaces in which nations redefined themselves, the quiet hollows where change, though unseen, began to take root. Across centuries and continents, the story of monarchy has often been told through the lens of those who reigned, who commanded armies, signed treaties, or changed nations with their decisions. Yet behind every ruler stands a constellation of lives that shaped history through their presence, their loss, and their silence. The earlier glimpses into Prince Arthur Tudor's fragile promise, Princess Alice's sorrowful endurance, and Prince George's unfulfilled potential reveal a truth often overlooked. The course of history is equally molded by those who stood close to power but were never allowed to hold it. The crown, with its brilliance and burden, casts a long and complex shadow, and within that shadow lie the stories of those who carried the weight of destiny without ever wearing its glittering symbol. These forgotten figures were neither minor nor insignificant. Their experiences mirrored the same struggles, ambitions, and heartbreaks that defined their more famous relatives, yet history has often relegated them to footnotes. In revisiting their lives, one discovers that the evolution of monarchy, and indeed of nations, owes much to the unseen influence of these so-called spare heirs and royal siblings. Their fates reveal the personal cost of political power and the fragile humanity that persisted even within the grandest palaces. The idea of the royal spare has always been both a safeguard and a sentence. To be born second in a line of succession was to exist as both an insurance policy and a potential threat. Monarchies, by design, required continuity, yet that same structure often turned siblings into symbols rather than individuals. Prince Arthur's early death proved how fragile that system could be. His brief life, shaped by dynastic planning and ended by illness, redirected the English crown to his younger brother Henry, whose reign reshaped religion, law, and society. Arthur's absence, more than his actions, defined a national turning point. It was the first echo of how loss at the heart of monarchy could alter the very identity of a nation. Princess Alice's life, marked by love, duty, and tragedy, carried that echo forward into the 19th century. Her compassion and sense of service stood in stark contrast to the rigid expectations placed upon her. Married to Louis of Hesse, she embraced her role with sincerity, but her personal life was a cycle of sacrifice. She faced the deaths of her children, navigated public health crises, and struggled against the confines of her position. Her grief mirrored the instability of the Europe she inhabited, a continent teetering between old dynastic loyalties and the tides of modern change. Her quiet endurance reflected the slow erosion of monarchical authority and the growing tension between duty and individuality. Then came the story of Prince George, Duke of Kent, a man born into a monarchy learning to survive in the modern world. His death during the Second World War symbolized another kind of loss, not only of life but of possibility. He represented a version of royalty that might have embraced openness, empathy, and modernity more fully than his predecessors dared. His absence, like Arthur's and Alice's before him, left the institution more cautious, more traditional, and less attuned to the shifting spirit of the age. Together, these stories form a pattern of recurring loss. Each sibling, in their time, embodied potential paths that monarchy might have taken, paths cut short by mortality, politics, or circumstance. Their departures were not merely personal tragedies, but structural turning points. The institutions that survived them bore the imprint of their absence. In this sense, their legacy is not written in triumphs but in consequences. To understand monarchy, one must understand this paradox. The crown is not a singular symbol, but a network of lives intertwined around a central figure. Its history is not just the story of kings and queens, but of brothers, sisters, and children who bore its invisible weight. The concept of sacrifice, often romanticized in royal narratives, takes on a different meaning when examined through their experiences. It was not always noble or voluntary. More often, it was imposed. They sacrificed privacy, autonomy, and often happiness to serve dynastic needs. Their personal dreams were subordinated to the interests of the state, their marriages arranged to secure alliances, their futures decided by councils and courts. The psychological cost of this system was profound. Many of these siblings lived under constant comparison, their identities defined by what they were not: the heir, the sovereign, the embodiment of continuity. They were expected to support without overshadowing, to exist within limits drawn by politics rather than personal desire. The strain of this dual existence, being both privileged and powerless, took a toll that history seldom records. It produced loneliness, resentment, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Yet within those emotional confines, moments of humanity and resilience shone through. Princess Alice's letters reveal a mind acutely aware of these tensions. She wrote not only of grief but of frustration at the limited space allowed for her compassion. She nursed the sick, advocated for better care for the poor, and spoke openly about the need for empathy in governance. These actions were radical in their simplicity, suggesting that royalty could serve not just as a symbol but as a participant in human struggle. Her influence, though largely invisible at the time, shaped future generations who embraced public service as part of royal duty. Her descendants carried forward that ethos, proving that even constrained lives could leave enduring marks. Prince George's story, too, illustrates the complexity of legacy. His interest in the arts, his charm, and his controversial friendships painted a portrait of a man caught between two worlds. He represented a version of monarchy that recognized the value of personal expression and cultural engagement. His untimely death prevented that potential from maturing, but the idea of a more accessible and relatable royal figure persisted. Decades later, when the monarchy began to reinvent itself for a media-driven age, it drew upon the qualities that George embodied. In that sense, his influence was delayed rather than lost. Even Prince Arthur, whose life was brief and largely controlled by others, left a shadow that stretched far beyond his years. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon and the political consequences of his death triggered one of the greatest religious transformations in European history. The English Reformation, though born of his brother's actions, was rooted in the vacuum his death created. The spiritual and cultural aftershocks of that event shaped centuries of politics, identity, and belief. Arthur never reigned, but his absence changed the world. These interconnected stories show that power is never contained solely in the throne. It radiates outward, touching everyone within its orbit, for better and for worse. The sacrifices of royal siblings were not isolated misfortunes. They were the human collateral of systems built on inheritance and hierarchy. The same structures that elevated one individual to near-mythic status required the suppression of others. Yet those others often provided the empathy, intellect, and perspective that gave monarchy its capacity for renewal. The political maneuvering surrounding these lives underscores how fragile royal power truly was. Dynastic alliances, strategic marriages, and the manipulation of succession were constant reminders that even the most powerful families were subject to forces beyond their control. Every birth or death could shift the balance of nations. When Arthur died, treaties were renegotiated, and the course of empire changed. When Alice suffered loss, her family's alliances weakened, and the moral image of monarchy evolved. When George's plane fell, the institution lost not only a man but a model for adaptation. These were not isolated tragedies, they were the mechanisms by which history turned. The psychological toll of such lives cannot be overstated. From childhood, these siblings were raised within structures that defined love in terms of duty and affection in terms of obligation. Their worth was measured not by their character, but by their utility to the crown. For some, like Princess Alice, this burden became a calling, a way to serve humanity, even within restriction. For others, like Prince George, it produced internal conflict and a longing for personal authenticity. The tension between expectation and individuality was the defining struggle of their existence, and it reveals that even within privilege, there was deep vulnerability. To look at these figures as mere footnotes is to misunderstand the nature of history itself. Their stories, though overshadowed, were essential to the survival and transformation of monarchy. They demonstrated resilience, compassion, and complexity at times when the institution risked ossification. Their private battles reflected the public challenges faced by their nations, and their losses forced those who remained to adapt. In many ways, the modern monarchy that exists today owes its character to the lessons learned from their sacrifices. The enduring legacy of these unseen lives lies in their quiet influence. They remind us that history is not simply a procession of rulers, but a mosaic of interdependent lives. Each decision, each loss, and each silence rippled outward, shaping events in ways that could never have been predicted. The power of monarchy has always been both personal and symbolic, and the tension between those two realms has produced as much tragedy as triumph. The stories of Arthur, Alice, and George make that tension visible. In tracing their journeys, one sees how the human cost of the crown extends far beyond the individual who wears it. The throne demands devotion, not only from the monarch, but from every member of the family bound to it. It consumes youth, freedom, and sometimes life itself. Yet from that sacrifice arises continuity, a fragile thread of identity that connects past to present. Without understanding the shadows that accompany it, the crown's radiance is incomplete. These stories also challenge the way history is remembered. Monarchy often survives by myth, by crafting narratives of strength, destiny, and divine purpose. But the truth, as these siblings' lives reveal, is far more complex. Behind every coronation lies a network of silenced voices, and behind every dynasty, a chain of personal cost. The forgotten siblings of royalty embody that hidden dimension of power. Their experiences expose the limits of privilege and the universality of pain. They remind us that even those born into the highest station are not spared the trials of fate. The shadows they left behind still shape our understanding of leadership and legacy. Their absence altered political alliances, cultural values, and even public perceptions of monarchy. In their silence, others found caution. In their suffering, later generations found empathy. The modern concept of a monarch as a servant leader, rather than a distant ruler, owes much to these hidden influences. Their humanity softened the institution, ensuring that it could adapt to an age that demanded authenticity and compassion. As history continues to unfold, the relevance of these lives persists. Every generation rediscovers the delicate balance between power and responsibility, between public image and private struggle. The lessons drawn from forgotten royal siblings remind us that greatness is often inseparable from sacrifice, and that influence can survive even in obscurity. The crown's endurance has depended not only on the wisdom of kings and queens, but on the endurance of those who stood beside them, offering unseen support or paying unseen prices.